Welcome, everyone. I am Bruno Pinto Silva. I'm a graduate student at the Department of Linguistics at the University of Sao Paulo. This event is part of the Abralin ao Vivo Linguista Online series, which is an initiative of Abralin, Associação Brasileira de Linguística, the Brazilian Linguistics Association, with the cooperation of many other international associations such as Comité Internacional Permanent de Linguistes, Asociación de Lingüística y Filología de América Latina, Sociedad Argentina de Estudios Lingüísticos, Sociedad Española de Lingüística, Linguistic Society of America, Linguistics Association of Great Britain, Societas Lingüística Europea, Australian Linguistic Society, Association Internationale de Linguistique Appliquée, and the British Association for Applied Linguistics. This event counts on the work of interpreters of TraduPoint, and you can watch it in Portuguese if you prefer. You can find a link to the interpreters in the description of this video. And I'm going to repeat myself in Portuguese. Esse evento contará com a participação de intérpretes, com interpretação para a língua portuguesa da TraduPoint. Se você quiser assistir em português, poderá encontrar o link na descrição deste vídeo. No entanto, as perguntas deverão ser feitas aqui no link principal. So the questions should be asked here on the main link. Today, we are here to talk about translation. We are going to listen to Dr. Stella Neumann, who is a professor at the Department of English Studies at the RWTH Aachen University in Germany. Professor Neumann has concentrated her studies and has written extensively on translation. Today, we'll see how translation can enrich our understanding of language use, as it is stated in the very title of today's presentation. What can we expect to hear? Well, I selected some sentences that I found on the very description of today's event, and I want to read them for you. The first one is, translation is a concern of linguistics and can, as it will be argued in this talk, enrich our understanding of language. Translation opens up new perspectives that link translation with areas such as second language learning, bilingualism, and L2 varieties. Translation is relevant for various fields of linguistics, including, but not limited to, contrastive linguistics, language contact, and change. Well, I myself come from translation studies, and I'm now working on contact linguistics, and I agree 100% with all these statements, and I'm eager to listen to this conference. Thank you so much, Professor Stella Neumann, for having accepted to be part of this event. Without further ado, let's listen to your presentation, your talk on the theme, translation, enriching our understanding of language use. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Bruno, for this very kind introduction. I'm very honored to be part of this. And I'm going to share my screen with you now. Let's see whether that works all right. Should be this. I hope that this works okay. And all right, so I should be set to go. Bom dia, Brasil. I would like to extend my warmest greetings to everyone online. I'm very excited about this fantastic format and would like to thank Abralin for enabling us to connect with other linguists around the globe. Although it can't make up for the lives lost due to the pandemic and all the severe consequences we will only start to really feel in the future, at least this is one truly positive effect emerging from this dramatic situation. So here's what I hope to be contributing to this mosaic of 21st century linguistics. Translation as one of the most complex ways in which language is used, or rather in which languages are used. My focus in this talk will be on empirical approaches, zooming in on advanced corpus approaches to the linguistic investigation of translation. So, what is translation? Now, my focus here will be on professional translation, which can be described as follows. A customer commissions a translator to turn a text from the source language SL into a text in the target language TL for a specified purpose, the so-called translation commission or brief, in a specific socio-cultural and situational context. So we are talking about human translation rather than, say, a machine translation, although this is a very exciting, thriving area, that's just not my area of expertise, so we will be concerned with human translation. What this means is that we will not be concerned with translation as an exercise for foreign language learning. Whereas in the foreign language classroom, literal translation plays a key role to demonstrate correct understanding of the target language grammatical features. In professional translation, the overall adequacy and usually also naturalness of the product, the output of the process, are important. So let me give you some idea of the translation process. The translator who has been commissioned with translating a certain text will read the source text and hopefully also understand the source text and ultimately produce the target text. And along the way, they might have to solve potential problems arising from the translation brief, the specificities of the translation brief, including time pressure, contrast of differences between the languages and cultures, as well as issues of experience involving, for instance, also the specific type of text to be translated. And at some point, once the target text is produced, the translator will hand over to other stakeholders in the overall workflow. Now, this is an important thing to bear in mind, and I will come back to these other stakeholders towards the end of my talk. So why should we bother about translation? Well, it's complicated. Translation is a parallel operation on two languages at the same time, and the translator is faced with both systemic as well as usage-based differences between the languages involved as well as the cultures involved. And specifically, the latter might include gaps in the target culture that the translator will need to account for. Moreover, the intentions of the original author are largely implicit, and the translator will have to make inferences about these intentions, as well as the intended audience, specifically also then the secondary audience in the target language. So this is then what empirical translation studies is concerned with, specifically with describing, understanding, predicting, and predicting the general principles that explain the phenomena arising from this complex form of language use. And so in this talk, my claim will be that such findings, the findings obtained by within empirical translation studies, can contribute to our more general understanding of language. Now, given this complexity, translation studies has been labeled an interdiscipline, which draws on insight from disciplines as diverse as literary studies and cultural studies, philosophy, language engineering, as well as linguistics. Now, it's fairly obvious that I will be concerned with linguistics in this talk. However, I will also draw on insights from language engineering, as you will see. Now, I promised in the abstract that I would approach this topic in 3 increasingly larger contexts, and I will start out by in the immediate translation process, and that's the area which is under investigation in process-based research, and this strand of research focuses on the translator's behavior while translating. And typically, this is done with the help of laboratory experiments using multiple methods, including eye tracking to record processes of reading the source text, as well as keystroke logging to record all the interactions of the participant with the computer while producing the translation. And experiments may also include various types of interviews with the participants, generated either concurrently while the participants carry out the experimental task. This is what you will know under the heading of Think Aloud protocols, or interviews will be carried out right after the end of the translation task to avoid the obstructive influence of concurrent interviews. Now, let me summarize some selected key findings of process-based research. First of all, a set of insights characterizing the process itself. Dragstedt and Gorm Hansen, 2008, showed that the translation process intimately interleaves source text processing with target text production, so that this doesn't happen in sequential order, but really interleaves. And they also described that sorry, I just forgot what I wanted to say. Yes, that translators spot potential translation problems early on when starting to read the source text. And these findings closely relate to Jacobsen and Jensen's findings about reading patterns for translation, and specifically Jacobsen and Jensen showed that translation-related reading differs significantly from general reading for comprehending. And to a large extent, this is due to the interleaving of source text processing and preparation for target text production. Other findings concern the strategies when producing the translation. Specifically, Balling and colleagues 2014 found that literal translation is one important initial default strategy when starting out the target text production. And Halverson 2015 describes default translation as a particularly unconstrained and immediate production mode. Now, strategic problem solving is also addressed by Alves and Gonçalves 2013, who showed that translators tend to get rid of the majorities of problems right away during the drafting phase of producing the target text, and then allocate more effort on the remaining issues. And these are primarily concerned with what has been called procedural encodings in relevance theory. And these procedural encodings connect discourse, for instance, negation, tense, determiners, word order, etc. Whereas conceptual encodings, that is, content words, require less effort on the translator's part. Now, I think that this latter paper is of general interest to linguistics. And I would also like to mention another finding, which I think is also of relevance to linguistics more generally, and that has to do with the overall translation strategy. Alves and Coutovale 2011 already indicated that the translation strategy of translators spans units larger than individual sentences. And this was corroborated by the paper by Alves and Gonçalves that I just referred to. And together with colleagues here in Aachen, we carried out a dedicated experiment to investigate this in more detail, and we found that translators tend to translate more literally if presented with isolated sentences than when translating the exact same sentences in larger stretches of text. And this is actually corroboration of psycholinguistic reading research, where it was shown by Hustegger and Budzianski 2010 that previous context will affect gaze behavior on the target sentence. And my conclusion on this basis is that the text is an important unit of language processing. And I think that this may be of use for linguists more generally, and maybe specifically psycholinguists. So far as process-based research is concerned, let me wrap up this part by raising two open questions. One concerns the focus of process-based research on the immediate process, obviously, and in line with this, on cognitive processing. Now, I would like to raise the question to what extent the process or translators during the process also respond to more general social pressure. And I think that that would also be something worthy of investigation in process-based research. Moreover, I think with its focus on the immediate translation process, process-based research will also have to work towards linking findings on the immediate process to the published translations that are actually used by the consumers in a culture. And specifically, this raises the question of the explanatory power of the focus on the immediate process vis-a-vis this role of translations in a culture. To some extent, this has been addressed in studies concerning the process-product interface, and specifically this aspect of the social context will be addressed in my second largest context, which focuses on translation in its sociocultural environment. And in this focus, in this context, the focus shifts from the behavior of the translator to the text produced by the translator, and the interaction between this text or translations more generally with other texts in the same lingua culture. And these other texts are then non-translated texts. Specifically, we're then also interested in the status that translations have in a given lingua culture. This perspective on translation was first introduced by Evin Zoha and his polysystem theory, which views the literary output of a culture as a system. So all of the texts, the literary texts, forming a system which potentially also involves subsystems. And translations may be or are then actually recognized as also forming a system, which can be, depending on the culture, either peripheral within the, or in relation to the overall system of texts, or it can be central in this overall system. Now, such a conceptualization of the body of texts produced in a culture more generally actually clearly works very well with a corpus linguistic methodology. And it has been further elaborated by Turi, who then also drew on Holmes' label of descriptive translation studies. And specifically, Mona Baker introduced the corpus linguistic approach to this investigation of translations in their interaction in a lingua culture with other texts. So the preferred methodology in this part of empirical translation studies is corpus analysis, the linguistic analysis of corpora, and these corpora then consist of translated and non-translated texts, either within one language only, and the translational English corpus directed by Mona Baker is an example of such a corpus, or the corpus will consist of originals in one language, in the source language, and the matching translations in the target language, and potentially in both translation directions. Now, let me summarize some findings of this corpus-based approach to translation studies. In a first wave of corpus studies, the focus was on linguistic properties of translations that set translations apart from non-translated texts. And specifically, these properties were concerned with target language orientation, that is a tendency to make the translation more standard-like, more norm-oriented in the target language, and in this sense, remove any non-standard features of the source text. And also, the opposite tendency was described, that is source language orientation. In this context, the translator will admit source language features to shine through in the translation, and this would be what has been called interference. Other properties that have been described are simplification and explicitation, and specifically the latter has generated heated debate in translation studies. And generally speaking, this first wave of corpus studies has yielded inconclusive findings. And I would claim that to a large extent, this is due to the fact that the research designs chosen by the individual studies were largely incomparable, with a focus on individual language pairs, only one translation direction, just one linguistic feature, and register mainly being controlled for. And so in this sense, the studies were fairly limited. And I would claim, in line with what Bresner in 2007 says about intuitions of grammaticality, that such studies may have underestimated the effects of multiple conflicting semantic and contextual constraints. So in one sense, based on these inconclusive findings, we might say that the corpus-based approach just doesn't really tell us much about the status of translation. However, computational approaches to what is then often called translationese consistently report high accuracies in classifying translated as opposed to non-translated texts. So just based on shallow linguistic features, computers or machine learning approaches are very well able to spot translated texts. And if that is the case, there must be something about the translations that sets them apart from non-translated texts. And therefore, I think that there is still room for further corpus-based research into the specific characteristics of translated texts. And this has also been the case in other studies where the multifactorial character of translation is foregrounded. And specifically, such studies have reported a differential influence of different languages. Isabelle Delave, in her 2015 PhD thesis, for instance, reported on a different effect of languages. Also, a whole set of studies, including my own previous work, have reported register-dependent patterns in translations. And also, several studies have reported on findings that can be explained by increased cognitive demand during translating, so that the choice of a more default option in translation may be explained by a processing strain, but it may also be explained by risk avoidance, because translators may try to avoid misunderstandings or align otherwise with norms of good writing. And this idea was originally introduced by Anthony Pym and discussed recently in a paper by Kruger and de Sutter. Also, as Sandra Halverson discusses in a sequence of papers, and most recently in 2017, the interaction between source language and target language priming is way more complex than initially assumed, so that we will have to take into consideration also aspects that are linguistic features that are cognitively salient, and even entrenched translation pairs of individual linguistic features. So the emerging picture is apparently more complex, and to some extent this is due to the fact that translators, and that's what I would claim, always have a choice how to translate. And this is the case even if the direct translation is blocked due to contrastive differences. In such a case, the translator can still choose not to translate a particular feature. So paradigmatic aspects of using language are very relevant from the point of view of translating. Now, in the next part of my talk, I would like to add or discuss our own contribution to understanding the multifactorial character of translation. And specifically, we do this with the help of multivariate corpus exploration, and this is done in collaboration with Stefan Ewert. Now, because what I'm going to discuss in the next few minutes is going to be fairly abstract, I would like to change gears here and introduce the specific multivariate corpus-based approach in more detail. I will start out by characterizing the individual data point. Now, this is, in our case, the text as a data point, not the individual construction, but rather the text as it is characterized by the frequencies of a whole set of quantitative linguistic features. And this makes it a feature vector. Additionally, the text is characterized by qualitative or meta information, and this includes the language in which the text is produced, whether it's an original or a translation, as well as information on the register and potentially also other information. Now, together with Stefan Ewert and Sascha Diversi, we developed the so-called geometric multivariate approach, which is inspired by Beiber's multidimensional approach, but has specific features. More specifically, this approach draws on an iterative procedure which allows us to visually interpret the individual data points, and including clusters that they may enter in multidimensional vector space. And this is possible because we draw on a set of multivariate techniques that facilitate the interpretation of geographic distances between data points as linguistic differences, right? So that if two texts as data points are visually set apart, this indicates that they are also linguistically different, but if they appear close to each other in multidimensional vector space, they will be interpreted as also linguistically similar. And because each individual data point is represented in vector space, we can actually assess the contribution of each data point to the emerging picture rather than having to draw on averages across groups, such as registers, which might exaggerate differences between clusters, where in fact the clusters are, well, actually overlap so that there are transitions between groups of data points. Now, in today's talk, I will pick out one multivariate technique out of this overall procedure, and this is linear discriminant analysis. Linear discriminant analysis is a machine learning technique, a supervised machine learning technique, which draws on some limited information in order to, and can then bring out subtle patterns of variation by finding a perspective that visually separates predetermined groups of texts based on the information introduced. So in what I'm going to discuss next, the information that we injected into the LDA was the language in which the text was written. LDA clusters data points by maximizing similarities between data points within a group and at the same time maximizing differences between groups. So I'm going to show you on the next slide this multidimensional vector space, which we can then visually inspect. And because we're talking about several dimensions, it's actually important to use a kind of visualization that allows us to take into consideration the geographic distances in various perspectives. And this can be visualized in such a cube where our overall data set can be thought of as a cloud in this cube. And in this visualization and in all of the following visualizations, each symbol represents one text as a data point, as it is characterized by all of the values for all variables included. Now, this still only gives a limited perspective on this multidimensional vector space. Now, please buckle up. I'm going to start a video now. And in this video, you should be able to appraise or to view the data set in different perspectives, more than just the sides of the cube. So in this visualization, in this video, the cube only turns along one axis, but you can very well imagine that you can turn around this cube in all kinds of directions so as to get a whole range of different perspectives on the data set. Now, as you can imagine, this is very difficult to report on paper. So to report the visualization of such a multidimensional space in 2 dimensions, we need to flatten out this vector space in 2 dimensions, and that's done with the help of such kinds of scatter plot matrices, where each of these plots actually represents one perspective on the same multidimensional space. So the first couple of dimensions are the sides of the cubes, but depending on the overall number of dimensions in vector space, that may be even more than just these plots. So in what follows, I will only use individual plots. I will start out by looking at the first 2 dimensions of a plot, and then later I will also talk about this plot, which summarizes the perspective, the combination of the first dimension and the third dimension. Okay, so let's look at the first study in more detail, and this study was concerned with the amount of shining through across translation directions. So in order to explain this, I first need to say a few more words about interference and shining through. Now, interference is a notion that you may be familiar with from second language acquisition studies or language learning, where it is also known as transfer or cross-linguistic influence. And it has been described as the automatic activation of L1 competencies triggered by L2 input. And this notion has been introduced by Turi to translation studies, where it is then captured as an influence of the source language on the target language. This has also then been linked to the parallel activation of the 2 languages involved in translating. And the idea here is then that source language competencies are automatically activated while producing the target text in the target language. And cognitively speaking, this target language is then also activated. And in this process, if we follow this cognitive line of reasoning, inhibition of the source language may be incomplete, so that certain source language features are admitted into the target text. So this is interference. Shining through is a specific perspective on interference, namely as a distributional effect. In this context, it is assumed, or this applies to situations where the 2 languages involved in translation share a comparable linguistic option, but differ in usage preferences, so that the translators may then actually overuse the source language option in the target language, even if it is dispreferred in the translation, in the target language, I should say. Let me exemplify this using the passive voice in English and German. In fact, we could claim that this feature is constructed in similar ways in English and German, but the distribution is different. So the in addition to the core passive, which is realized in very similar ways, drawing on an auxiliary and a past participle in both languages, German also draws to some extent fairly frequently on functionally related options, as, for example, the indefinite pronoun, as in example number 1 here, which also allows the language user to underspecify the agent. And the verb is then still in the active voice. So this example, wie kann man der Globalisierung eine politische Richtung geben? How can one the globalization a political direction give? Was translated in the Croco corpus by the core passive. How can globalization be given a political direction? So in some sense, this would be rather a tendency to use the more default option, a normal feature in the target language. But if the translator chooses the option which is still possible, but less frequent in the target language, this would be a case of shining through. For instance, if the translator had opted for the indefinite pronoun in English, that would have been a case of shining through. How can one give globalization a political direction? This is still possible in English, but it's much less frequent than the comparable construction in German. So what Stefan Ewert and I did for investigating shining through in the language pair English and German was take 150 text pairs from the English-German translation corpus Croco, and specifically these pairs were taken from both translation directions across 5 different registers. And we then took the frequencies of 27 comparable lexicogrammatical features that I originally collected for my 2014 study, and we included them as log transformed z-scores to mitigate the influence of extreme outliers, and all of the features were normalized for suitable units of measurements. And that may be, for instance, the number of nouns per text in relation to the number of words, but also the number of modal verbs, for instance, in relation to the number of verbs, the number of finites per sentences, past tense verbs per finites, etc. Also things like lexical density. I actually uploaded a handout accompanying this talk to my ResearchGate account, and this handout also includes a complete list of all the features included in this multivariate analysis taken from the appendix of the paper by Ewert and Neumann 2017. So based on this methodology, we retrieved the following findings, and these are the first 2 dimensions of the multivariate analysis, focusing on the linear discriminant analysis here. And specifically what we found was, no, let me just say this, on the y-axis here, you see dimension 1, on the x-axis dimension 2, and so the distribution according to dimension 1 can be viewed in the vertical axis, and also any potential clusters of data points. So we might, no, let me just start out by saying this. The originals in both languages are located in separate areas of this vertical axis, all of the English originals represented here as black plus symbols are on the positive side of this axis, and all of the German originals represented by black circles are on the negative side of this dimension. And so we interpreted this dimension as the difference between German and English. And in fact, the separation of the two languages is complete. Now, what about the translations? One might expect a perfect overlap between all texts originally produced in one language and all translations into that language, so that all English translations can be found in the area of English and all German translations in the area of German, right? Now, what did we actually find? And now we're concentrating on the red symbols. The English translations are in this area and mainly overlapping with the English originals, and the German translations are in this area, again, to a large extent overlapping with the German originals. However, there are also areas of overlap with the respective source language, so that we can actually identify shining through in both directions. However, there is a significant difference between the translation directions. There is statistically significantly more shining through in translations into German, and that can be seen here in the area of overlap with the English originals, the source language. So the English, as I said, the English translations largely overlap with English originals. Only in this area do we see overlap with German as the source language, and this is the area in which the German translations overlap with their source language, English, and that is a fairly large number of translations. So what can we gather from these observations? If the cognitive assumption of parallel activation was the main explanation for shining through, for interference, we shouldn't see a difference in the amount of shining through between the languages. There should be just as much shining through in English translation as in German translations. So based on these considerations, we would claim that the directionality, the unidirectional shining through that we actually observe is at odds with assumptions about parallel activation, which still applies. I'm not refuting this claim, but it's apparently not the only explanation. In fact, we came to the conclusion that the differences are due to the different status of translations in the respective system of texts in each lingua culture. More specifically, we assume that English has a higher prestige as compared to German for both cultures, so that English translators find it important to make their translations be as similar as possible with texts produced originally in English, and consequently the status of translations in this system is peripheral. By contrast, due to the higher prestige of English in the language pair, German translators find it more acceptable to admit features more typical of English into their translations, so that the translations have more similarities with English texts than with German texts. So far, so good. Now, you may have wondered while I've been talking about the vertical axis, what about the variation along the horizontal axis that you can clearly see in this plot? Well, Stefan Ewert and I thought that the distribution on the x-axis may be due to differences between the registers in the corpus, the 5 different registers. However, since our data set was fairly small, we were unable to isolate a clear effect given the very few data points per register. But still, this was our assumption that the second dimension actually captures register variation. So since the data set was that small, we teamed up with Geert de Sutte to do a larger study, this time drawing on the language pair English and Dutch, and the much larger Dutch parallel corpus, which also allowed us to test our findings from the language pair English-German on a similar language pair, namely English and Dutch, which can be said to reflect similar relationships in terms of prestige of the languages involved. So in this study, we used 402 text pairs. So that's much more than in the original study. And these were taken from 8 different text categories. And this overall bigger data set also allowed us to explore the influence of register. This time we used 41 comparable feature frequencies, again log transformed as z-scores as before. And what you can see here is again the first dimensions of the linear discriminant analysis, and you may see that again the originals in the 2 languages are clearly separated along the vertical axis, and the translations cover some space in between the originals. However, if you look more closely at this plot, you may actually see that there is an area over here where there are also black data points in between the 2 clusters for the 2 languages. And in fact, we could claim that the 2 clusters make contact in this region. This means that the 2 languages aren't clearly separated in this region anymore. So we were a bit puzzled by this observation, and we had a closer look at the data set, and it turned out that the texts in this region are texts mainly from one particular register, that's corporate communication, that's this, as well as press releases by companies. And it turned out that these were texts by Belgian companies, Dutch-Belgian companies whose corporate language is English. And accordingly, the texts produced by these Belgian companies were labeled as English originals, but potentially written by Dutch L1 speakers. And these texts were then, so to speak, back translated into Dutch. Now, apparently, these English originals produced by L1 speakers of Dutch share features that make them more similar with Dutch originals. And this made us discuss for a long time whether we should include these texts, which are then actually English as lingua franca use, so as to get to the real originals. However, what is the linguistic backgrounds of writers of original texts in a language? Do we actually know all we need to know about their linguistic background? Can we ascertain that they are all monolinguals? How many speakers in the world are monolinguals in the first place? Especially given psycholinguistic insight into the fact that the L1 is not a stable concept. So we came to the conclusion that we don't have a principled way to exclude these English as a lingua franca speakers from the corpus, but rather that this is actually the reality of language use that we see here. And in fact, it is an interesting research question to investigate the interaction between of the writers or translators' languages in more detail, rather than focusing on a special case of only monolingual writers, which may then be of limited informational value in terms of the reality of language use. So we were then stuck with the interaction between the L1 and the L2 in translation, and I will continue to talk about that. But before I move on to a last third study, I would like to quickly also mention that we still managed to confirm the directionality effect that we observed in the language pair English and German. However, the effect was smaller in the English pair, language pair English-Dutch. If you want to hear more about that, ask me about this in the Q&A session. I would now like to continue with looking in more detail at the interaction between L1 and L2 language use. For this purpose, I teamed up again with colleagues from Aachen, with Emma Kertz and Arndt Hallmann, an expert in language learning and a translation expert. And we compiled a data set consisting of texts taken from 6 different corpora. So the data set covered academic writing, L1 and L2 academic writing, and specifically, it also involved novice academic writing by students. One combination of subsets involved bilingual writing situations, students, speakers of German, learning to write academic texts in English, as well as English translations taken again from the Croco corpus. And lastly, we had a set of 2 reference corpora, the originals from the Croco corpus, as well as expert academic writing in comparable disciplines. And in this plot, in this part of the linear discriminant analysis, I am now talking about dimension 1 again as before, but this time combining this with dimension 3. So let me start out by walking you through what we see in the vertical action axis along dimension 1. We can very clearly see a cluster in the on the positive side of this dimension. That's all of the expert texts actually up here. And then we have an area still on the positive side of this dimension towards the middle, where we can only find other texts from the academic register, all of these produced by novice writers, regardless of whether it's the L1 or the L2. And then on the negative side of this vertical axis, we find all the translations and originals from the Croco corpus. And this makes sense because none of these texts is from the highly specialized academic register. So this led us to characterize this vertical dimension as non-specialized versus specialized expertise, right? So what about the horizontal axis here? Dimension number 3. Now, what you can see is that there is some clear separation or difference between the data points below minus 0.5 on this horizontal axis. You can only find texts, either originals in English or academic texts produced by L1 speakers. And all of the translations are in this region towards the positive side of this horizontal dimension, and all of the novice academic texts produced by L2 writers of English are in this region to some extent overlapping with the translations in this middle region of the horizontal axis. But actually, the L2 texts are even more extreme on this dimension. So there may actually be even more shining through of features of the L1 in these L2 texts. Please note that all of the Croco originals in black again here are on the negative side of the dimension. You can't find a single Croco original on the positive side. What we do see is that there are some clear continuities, especially in this area of overlap between aspects of language learning and translation, so that we could claim that these actually capture related phenomena of bilingual text production. And consequently, we interpret this dimension 3 as capturing the difference between monolingual and bilingual text production. All right. So far as to the results that I wanted to share with you, let me give you a brief intermediate summary of this corpus-based part. I hope to have shown that these product-based corpus studies illustrate the socio-cultural embeddedness of translations in their complex interaction with the lingua cultures involved. And I would like to draw your attention to Heidi Kruger's study of the South African context to see an even more complex relationship between the different aspects of lingua cultures. Moreover, I hope to also have shown that translation interacts with other forms of bilingual language use, so that there are some clear continuities between translating and other phenomena of language learning, and this may actually also extend to contact varieties, which in themselves form another continuity with L2 language use. Now, again, this approach to the investigation of translations also leaves some questions open, and I would like to share these with you now. One is related to recent findings about the role of other stakeholders in the translation workflow. Specifically, Mario Biziada and Heidi Kruger showed that editors play an important role and may potentially be the people, the stakeholders who introduce the features that we think of as properties of translations, where the translations that the translators actually submitted look much more normal in the target language. And these findings might actually call the entire corpus-based approach to translation properties into questions. However, what we need to take into consideration here is what actually counts as the text. Is that what a writer or a translator produces? Or rather what is then ultimately published and received, consumed by members of the culture? And Kruger and von Roy argue in this context that editing is just simply part and parcel of the mechanisms of written language production, rather than something, and I quote, that the linguist should wish away as noise or as changed imposed on authentic data. However, we will still need some explanations for the successful classification of translations that I mentioned before. It might be possible that it is actually the editors who bring in the features that the computer responds to. And still, we should bear in mind that the editors are also part of the overall lingua culture and may actually respond to the status of translations in the overall system of texts, drawing again on polysystems theory. So this is one question. Another question concerns epistemological aspects. Given the contribution of other stakeholders in the workflow, it may be questionable to what extent corpus-based findings about published translations can be linked to more specific insight on the process. And so just like what I said about process-based research, corpus-based research will also have to work towards linking findings and to account for the kind of knowledge that it produces. Now, this brings me to the largest context in which I would like to discuss translation today, and that is in the context of the contribution that the investigation of translations can make to linguistics more generally. So what is it that linguistics has to gain from accounting for translation? First of all, I hope to have shown the centrality of text as the largest unit of linguistic description. So we might not stop at the sentence or clause boundaries in order to describe and understand language, but we may need to account much more centrally for text. At least I think that this is of interest for research on language processing. Moreover, I hope to have shown that influence factors other than cognition may need to be drawn on to understand what's going on in bilingual contexts of language use, because apparently parallel activation of the two language systems does not exhaust the explanation, the observations about variation. I didn't really talk a lot about contrastive linguistics in this talk. Implicitly, it showed up in the visualizations that I discussed of English, German, and English, Dutch data. This multivariate analysis suggests that translations may not be a reliable basis of comparison for contrastive comparisons. And this is also something that I discuss in a conformational approach in a paper that is about to appear. Lastly, I think that translation can also contribute to the investigation of language contact. Recent years have seen more close interaction between the communities, the study of varieties, specifically contact varieties or L2 varieties, and learner English, looking at the continuities between these two forms of language use. The comparison of learner varieties and translations has been a long-standing interest of Sylviane Granger, and has now been combined with also a perspective on learner translations. Kruger and Van Roy also investigate more continuities, labeling all of these different types of varieties which are used in the context of more than one language system as constrained language use, and have highlighted the continuities between all of these varieties, so that there are actually a whole set of dimensions according to Kruger 2018, which can help us capture these continuities. And I think that this is of importance to understanding language more generally. At the same time, I think that translation studies has a lot to gain from drawing on linguistics. Especially, I think that drawing on a characterization of language in terms of probabilistic choices, as has been done by Halliday, but also by Joan Bresnan in the context of probabilistic grammar, would help us understand the patterns in translations in a more realistic perspective, namely that they reflect tendencies rather than categorical differences, as advocated by Turi 2004 and shown in recent studies. And lastly, last but not least, I think that translation scholars can come up with much deeper explanations of the phenomena that they describe if they draw on language theory. And this has been demonstrated by various studies already. For instance, Alves and Gonçalves drawing on relevance theory to account for the effort spent on specific parts of translation. A range of studies, specifically Halverson in her work drawing on Langeke's cognitive grammar, who shows how much deeper explanations of default translation can be if we draw on notions such as entrenchment and cognitive salience. And there is actually a whole community of translation scholars who draw on systemic functional linguistics to not only model specific aspects of translation, but also to theorize the translator's choice, as well as to locate translation in the theoretical framework of language theory, as has been done by Erich Steiner and Sylvia Hansen-Schill. And that's actually all I wanted to discuss with you today. Let me finish with a very simple take-home message. Translation is language use, and investigating it can be beneficial both for translation studies, but also for linguistics. And I would like to thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you so much, Professor Stella Neumann. We very much enjoyed your presentation. Undoubtedly, translation is really relevant to general linguistics. And as you stated, something that caught my attention is that translators translate differently isolated sentences, or if they are translating that very same sentence in a text. And I was thinking about descriptive linguists who go do field work and have to rely on translators of that language because at first they don't know the language, and they can have different results if they ask their translators to help with an isolated sentence or that very same sentence in a text. And I myself, I'm working with a language that I speak, which is not my native language, but I speak fluently and have worked as an interpreter to this language. And it's very interesting that oftentimes I will disagree with the data I find or the description of the data I find in previous works. I think knowing the language helps me with that, definitely. And I see the relevance of that. So we have a few questions here. So I'm going to start with this question from Chris Royes. Well, hi, I'm Chris Royes, a teacher from Brazil. I think the most hard thing in translation is to exchange two cultures. What do you think about it?
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. You know, I've referred to lingua culture wherever I could in my talk to acknowledge the fact that you can't divorce a language from a culture, and this already underlines the importance of cultures, and indeed differences between the cultures show in differences between languages, and they surface as translation problems for translators. And to a large extent, not a large extent, but one key part of translator training is to learn how to handle such differences, gaps between the cultures that the translator will have to account for. And there are various strategies have been described in the literature, and what they all have in common that for the translator, they're in a sense not really satisfactory, because they all involve some measure of deviation from what we perceive so clearly in the source text. But yeah, that's the reality of translating. And also, Bruno, what you said before just really illustrates the complexity, the challenge of the task. And so that we can't just simply take anything for granted, but that it is indeed a complex phenomenon.
Yeah, I recall a conference of Professor David Crystal. He said that translation is one of the most complex things there is. He even says as a joke, well, brain surgery, that's easy. Try translating.
Yeah.
Well, there is another question by Fabio Alves.
Hi, Fabio.
Could a GMA approach and a linear discriminant analysis in particular be of interest to contact linguistics? If so, how could GMA provide a contribution from empirical translation studies to throw light into issues related to language change in contemporary settings?
Thanks a lot for this question. In fact, one of the papers that I referenced, that's Neumann and Evert submitted, is a paper that's not concerned with translation, but draws on this approach that we originally developed, not just with translation in mind. The original paper, including our colleague Sasha Diversi, actually already involved varieties, in that case of French. So I believe that this approach can be actually used for various contexts. It is, in a sense, even easier to use it on just one language, because then you don't have to worry about the comparability of the features in the contrastive enterprise, and that creates obviously a lot of issues for this for the analysis. We are to some extent still in the process of further developing the approach, and we are looking forward to applying it to further contexts. So far we applied it on translation, the contrastive comparison of languages, as well as varieties, different varieties of a given language. If we extend it to diachronic data sets, we will probably have to again look at the comparability of the features included. For each individual study, that needs to be checked to what extent the features can just simply be applied to all data sets included. And I hope that that answers the question.
Thank you. Well, I have seen that you, it's fantastic to work with the parallel corpora. I have never worked with it. And I'm very interested in getting to know more about the procedures to build such a corpus or corpora. Can you say something on that?
Thanks very much. Yes, I was a part of the team that compiled the Croco corpus, the English German translation corpus, and it's not easy. It's a challenging task, and there are various problems. One is to find, usually when you compile a corpus, you will want it to cover various genres or registers, right? If you then want to compile a data set that is comparable across two languages, you will first of all have to be able to identify comparable registers in the two languages. And in the next step, if you want to include translations, you will have to find those registers that are actually translated between the two languages. And that clearly reduces the data set, the possible number of registers, to the extent that you will get what may appear as a fairly skewed selection of registers in a given data set. What I learned from working with a whole set of different corpora is that the amount of effort that you spend on the compilation, really looking very closely at the extent to which the texts are comparable, is extremely important. And let me maybe just share one slide that I removed from my talk, just so that you get some indication of resources, comparable resources, translation corpora. This is a visualization of the Oslo multilingual corpus, one of the first translation corpora compiled under the direction of Stig Johansson and Katrine Fabricius Hansen. But there is, for instance, also a corpus for the language pair Portuguese and English. That's the Compara corpus. If you're interested in other similar resources, here's a link to Clarín.
Thank you so much. There is another question. Could you comment on the difference between the German corpus and the Dutch corpus? What do they review about directionality, prestige, and social constraints on translation process and product?
Yes. Thanks a lot. So in a sense, I think that this is a question about what I didn't explain in my talk. So I will go back actually. No, let me just stop this and go back to that slide if I can. So I didn't really discuss the actual findings of this paper because I really wanted to highlight this particular observation that we came across while working on this. But basically, so the difference between the English-German croco corpus and the English-Dutch parallel corpus is first and foremost one of size. The Dutch parallel corpus is, I think, 11 times bigger than the English-German croco corpus. It also includes a third language, and that's French. And that makes it particularly interesting, especially given the Belgian context in which the corpus was compiled, where Dutch and French are official languages, so that it might be possible to actually investigate even further complex status or prestige effects between the three languages involved. And that is still something that's at the back of our minds. But before we get to that, we first need to publish this study. And we will probably have to team up with an expert on French as well for that purpose. Also, the comparability, questions of comparability of features will multiply when including another data set. So I said that we still found a similar effect, directionality effect, even also in this data set, so in the English-Dutch data set, meaning that there was more shining through into Dutch, in Dutch translation, than in English translation. But the effect was smaller, as I said, and we still need to come to terms with this puzzling observation. But one explanation is the so-called Germanic sandwich. Dutch has been described as the Germanic sandwich. That means that it is squeezed in between English and German, so that it shares similarities with both languages. And to some extent, what this may also mean is that it already absorbed some features of English, so that these features of English are already part of the Dutch text, and therefore Dutch may already be more similar to English. Now, I should point out that this is really Geert de Sutte's explanation. I don't want to suggest that this is something that I came up with, but this is actually what Geert said about these observations. And I think this is actually a plausible explanation. So that the interaction between English and Dutch in terms of the different prestige of the two languages already accounts for the hierarchy between the two languages. And I hope that this answers the question.
Okay, thank you so much. Another question, as you were saying, we can notice the influence from the source language into the target language in translation. can we say that we would see less of an influence if the translator is a native speaker of the target language?
Haha.
Or can I add?
Yes, please.
Can we measure the proficiency or the experience of the translator too, somehow?
This would actually be very good and should be done in future studies. So this should be one additional information that we introduce to the multivariate analysis. We haven't done so yet because we basically drew on existing corpus resources. And in order to do that, we would have to collect new data, right? And ask translators to give us not only their translations, but also test their proficiency. But that would be extremely meaningful, I think, and would greatly help us. Now, as to the L1 of the translator, that is actually something, or let me rephrase that. Studies of bilingualism and directionality in translation have not provided clear-cut indications of of translating into the L1 being better. In fact, it may actually be advantageous, and I'm quoting Wyatt 2019 here, as well as Fonseca 2015, and there are other scholars who've worked on this, Nika Pocon, for instance. So what such studies show is that in certain contexts, it may actually be desirable to to translate into the L2, because it's then easier to understand the source text in the L1, in the translator's L1, right? So depending again on the register, this might be advantageous. So the question of whether, I mean, this is the prescriptive claim also according to which I was trained as a translator, that translating into my L1 would be preferable. But in fact, there is no hard and fast empirical evidence that supports this prescriptive claim. And I hope to have shown in this talk as well that the relationships between the two languages can also be characterized in more complex ways, even without accounting for whether the translator translates into the L1 or the L2, because that's not something that was included in my studies. But this is a very important aspect. And again, I think that this can also then tell us something about language use more generally.
Thank you. Well, I have a question of my own here. If I am to compile a corpus to not analysis of translations, but of the language, this corpus happens to be of translated texts, can I rely? Is it reliable? Is it trustworthy to work with the?
Okay, so yes, thanks. My reply to this will be very, very general, and this is, in a sense, key to my understanding of language. So this is at the core of the conceptualization of language. Now, in functional approaches to language, usage-based approaches to language, whichever way we use language is language use, right? That's a proper use of language, and it is not one that is in somehow inferior or to be ignored, right? In that sense, I could claim that you might want to just simply use translations. However, obviously, we know, and we have a growing body of evidence showing the extent to which translations display specific features, linguistic features, for various reasons, right? That's the multiple factors. And based on that, if you compile a corpus consisting only of translations, you will get a very specific idea of a given language. And the same is true if all of your texts are from just one register, right? So, and actually the same is also true if all of your texts are produced in writing by educated speakers only. And that is true for all corpora that I know of, right? So whenever your data set draws on some kind of homogeneous selection of the vast variety of possibilities of language use, you will get some, specific idea of language. And ultimately, you would want to just simply include all of the manifold ways in which a given language can be used, and collect all of the contextual information so that you can account for the specificities of the given register, of whether it's a translation, of whether it was produced in the language in which the language user is not as proficient as in another language, etc.
Thank you. Well, one last question. So we know about the advances in technology and all the helpful resources we have now, the helpful tools that we have now. But regarding translation, will computers ever replace human?
Yes. I think that human translators, I'm afraid, I'm worried that human translators are an endangered species, like so many professions. I don't think that this will completely stop. There may be specific contexts in which we will continue to draw on human translations, but there may be other registers or contexts in which the machine takes the front seat. For instance, in the European institutions, machine translation is already used as a pre-processing step, so that the role of the human translator has already changed considerably. So that what translators in fact do is machine translation post-editing. And that also changes what is being taught at translation departments, university departments. When I prepared for this talk, initially I wanted to give the audience a small task, but then I didn't know how to do this. And that included looking at the output of various machine translation tools, Google Translate, the Bing Translator, DeepL, etc. And I did collect the translations, and one of the most striking things to me was how different they were. It was like the different translations that a human would also produce. And I think that is actually quite interesting. The extent to which potentially machine translation also has similarities with human translation. And certainly I think the more we understand human translation, the more we can also understand it in comparison with machine translation. Whether we want to teach that to the computer, that's a different question. Maybe yes.
Okay, I try to be optimistic and think that, well, but that's true, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, the world is changing.
Yes, yeah, that's true. Well, thank you so much, Professor.
Thank you very much.
We really enjoyed having you here with us this morning in Brazil. I think it's afternoon in Germany.
Yes.
I'm not sure. Yeah. Okay. I want to thank also the interpreters, our colleagues who have been translating this conference into Portuguese, have been interpreting into Portuguese. Also, I would like to remind everyone watching this conference that it is very important, if you're not associated to Abralin, to do so, to consider doing so, because it'll strengthen our area of studies, and also you can collaborate in many projects. We also encourage everyone to keep on sharing the series of events with everyone in their social networks and among colleagues, friends. We have many events that are planned. Some of them are, you can always be checking the updated list of events on the website, abralin.org. And also follow us on our social network, such as on Instagram, Facebook. It is very important as well. So Professor Stella Neumann, if you want to say some final words, you have the stage.
Thank you so much, Bruno, for guiding me through this. That was a great pleasure. Thank you so much to Abralin for organizing this, and stay safe, everyone, please. Bye-bye.